Isa na lang.
Ilan sila lahat?
3 webinars po bale. Kayo yung pangalawa.
Okay. So
Ano yung iba?
tuwang-tuwa si Joel sa iyo, ikaw ang masipag mag-organize ng webinar. Gustong-gusto niya 'yun eh. Yung mga
Webinars.
DSA webinars.
Yeah.
It's all
For-
good.
We are live.
Okay.
Should we let people in?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, please. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to the Ateneo Department of Sociology and Anthropologies and the Anthropological and Sociological initiatives of the Ateneo Seminar Series on the web. This is the second installment of this webinar series. And today we will be talking about the concept of alternative development. And we will also be delving extensively into alternatives to development and the need for such alternatives. So this particular online conversation attempts to expand and deepen contemporary interpretations of alternative development. It also intends to shed light on and draw substantial insight from the stories of urban informals, confronting housing issues and the ways their experiences inform how they define, imagine, contest, and seek alternatives that genuinely include and empower. For this afternoon, we are privileged and honored to have with us two distinguished resource speakers who are sociologists of development and who have extensive experience or background working with communities and grassroots, shall we say, representatives. Our first speaker is Dr. Ana Marie Caraos from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And the title of her paper or her presentation is Housing by the Urban Poor in Search of an Alternative to the Alternative. She will be followed by Dr. Melissa Quetulio Navarra, who is also a faculty at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of Ateneo de Manila University. And she will be presenting on the disadvantaged making development, alternative development wins, cases in the resettlement sites. So before we begin, allow me to share some house rules. Kindly ensure that your microphones are turned off during the session, especially when our resource speakers are presenting. We would also like to request participants to turn off their video cameras to conserve bandwidth. We encourage participants of this online conversation to engage with the speakers through the chat box. There will be an open forum after our two speakers have presented. So you're free to write your questions through the chat box, and I would be happy to share them with our speakers later on. Please also close any running notifications or apps to avoid experiencing internet disruptions or video lagging. Lastly, please put your screen on speaker view as well. Okay, so to begin, may we call on Dr. Ana Marie Caraos to give her presentation this afternoon. Dr. Caraos, good afternoon, and we are pleased to have you today.
Good afternoon, Dr. Leviste, and good afternoon to everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Thank you for the invitation to speak at this webinar. Okay, I think my presentation is being shared now. All right. I modified a little bit the title of my presentation. So it's still, I mean, the theme is still in search of an alternative to the alternative, but I also maybe subtitled it Privatizing a Social Problem, referring to the urban housing crisis in the country. Next slide, please. The outline of my presentation is as follows. First, I will talk about people's participation and alternative development, especially for those who are maybe taking this basic course on development. What is the concept of people's participation and what is its place in the search for development paradigms? And in that context, I will be presenting a spectrum of housing strategies by the urban poor as observed and as practiced in the Philippine context. And I will specifically be zeroing in on the case of the community mortgage program, which is a program which in some respects exemplifies an alternative mode of development, in the sense that it is relying to a great extent on community processes. And then finally, taking a more critical look at this sort of alternative process of development from the lens of participation and from the context of rights and social justice. Okay, so let's begin. Thank you. Next slide, please. Just for context, when we talk about the urban housing problem in the country, we are referring to urban poor, basically, who have very limited access to formal housing tenure or formal land tenure in the country. And there are about 4.5 million of them, Filipinos, which roughly correspond to 900,000 families living in what we call informal settlements. But that is as of 2015. So we expect that this number is almost a million families today. And in Metro Manila would account for about 2/3 of that number, about 3 million Filipinos or 600,000 families. Next slide, please. So these would be informal settlements on private lands, also on public lands, and on areas that are left unoccupied because they probably or most likely be considered as danger areas. Next slide, please. Now, to situate the concept of people's participation in development, I drew a timeline here, just for, I mean, it's a very simplistic timeline, I realize that, but just for us to have a sense of the progression of this idea of people's participation as an important component of development. In the 50s up to the 70s, there was this expectation that economic development would automatically translate to improvements in people's standards of living, including the poor. So improvements in living standards was something that was expected to be accessible to everyone in developing countries. So not only the developed countries, but also in the developing countries, because, well, those familiar with development theory would know that this was the period when modernization theory was in currency, and therefore the expectation that all countries will be on a path to development, and that development will bring about more or less improvements in people's living standards that's almost accessible to everyone. So that was the promise of modernization in that period. But by the 1980s, it has become quite clear that poverty has been persisting, and there was very little improvements in the conditions of poor people, whether urban or rural poor, despite the economic progress that was being experienced by many of these countries, the developing or poor countries. And in that time, it was mostly attributed to bad governance. So you would appreciate maybe that this pertained to many countries that were former colonies, so new um, independent states, and many of them were struggling with their governance institutions. And so the lack of economic improvements on the part of the population who are poor was basically attributed to bad governance. Okay, so many other things that were wrong with the economics and the politics of these governments at that time were attributed to bad governance. So it was poor governance. So in the 1990s, good governance came to be talked about. So these were the keywords of the time: good governance, accountability, transparency, democracy, including people's participation. And it was also during this time when human development was emphasized. So we had the Human Development Index and these new ways of measuring development that was not only reduced to economic indicators, but also human development indicators. So there was a lot of focus and emphasis on improving human capital, education, health, and so on. And after this, we had the Millennium Development Goals, which precisely tried to emphasize human development. But I just wanted to emphasize at this point that this was more or less the the development of this concept of people's participation and its role in bringing about development, in a sense, because of the failures of the type of modernization process that had been happening since the 1950s that failed to deliver on the promises of economic improvement and mobility of people who are poor, despite the economic successes that were being seen in terms of economic indicators. Next slide, please. So we are at the point that people's participation has become accepted as part of good governance. So good governance is not only something that should come from the top in terms of improving transparency, accountability, and so on, but good governance has to include, at least that's the theory, people's participation. So what had been the Philippine government's responses to the problem of homelessness or the existence of slums? And they were, instead of them decreasing, they were even expanding, increasing in number, and so-called informal settlements. No? So again, it's like a history, this is a timeline of these government responses. From the 1950s, so this is after the war. Okay, so we had such informal settlements mainly in the port areas, for example. What grew to be Tondo, for example, which later on grew to become Asia's and certainly the Philippines' largest slum settlement since the 1960s. Is because of these migrants that have settled in the port areas, and they were working in the ports, and they started to build their communities in those areas. But from the 1950s, the first response that government had tried was slum clearance, because they were seen to be unsightly and not safe, and so the first response was to clear them. You will notice that this is an old response, but this has continued through the present time. In other words, we have not graduated from this very, quite outdated strategy or government response. So from the 1950s, governments, whether local governments or national governments, have still been employing this strategy of slum clearance, but it's as old as the 1950s. In the 1960s, there was already the relocation of informal settlers to off-city resettlement sites. So, for example, Tondo for a time, and then there was this relocation. People who were already born at that time, would recall the Sapang Palay, as the place where informal settlers from Manila were brought. So it was very far. It's still very far, even now, in Bulacan. So informal settlers were brought there, the off-city resettlement sites. Then in the 1970s, international or agencies, humanitarian agencies, initiated this program of on-site upgrading. In the time of President Marcos, he instituted the Zonal Improvement Program, which is a program for upgrading existing slums or informal settlements on-site. But they're not being granted tenure necessarily, but at least the housing conditions and the living conditions and the site um, conditions in the site are improved. So this continues even to well, not anymore known as zonal improvement program, but something like this is being done by some local governments. So the relocation of informal settlers, which started in the 1960s, continues also up to the present time. Now, in the 1990s, no, corresponding to this popularization of people's participation in the Philippines, there was a new program that was introduced after 1986 People Power uprising. We had the community mortgage program, which I will talk about no, later on in greater detail. And this involved the formalization of on-site tenure and housing of informal settlers. No? And this is community-led. So that's from the 1990s to the present time. So you will notice at the present, we still have these strategies with us. So even the slum clearance still with us. Certainly the large-scale relocation of informal settlers to off-city resettlement sites, which Dr. Navarra will talk about more later. And certainly this on-site upgrading, known by different names now, not anymore ZIP, but to a very limited extent. No? So it's almost, it's not really worthy to be mentioned at all, no? Because it's not really a mainstream program. And then we have the community mortgage program. Next slide, please. So this is the historical context. No? So now I speak of a spectrum really of, I call it alternative development because only to the extent that it is housing by the urban poor. Actually, the term alternative is not really correct in a sense, no? But I just oppose it because it's an alternative to government-initiated housing. It's an alternative to housing for the poor. This is housing by the poor. Okay, so it's the urban poor who are really solving their housing problem. So it's in that sense, I label it alternative development. And there is a spectrum. No, there's a spectrum of alternative development by the urban poor, starting from, and this is very common, and all of us know about this, informal land occupation. You in the past we call this squatting, all right, squatting. Informal land occupation, people occupy unused land and they build housing there, very simple, shanty, makeshift housing, and they improve on it incrementally over time, no? As the need arises, as they add new members to the household or as their resources enable them to add a new room or an extra floor, no, after a period of time. And then there's also the practice of renting a room that has been informally built, no, on such land which is not really owned by the person who built the house. So it's renting a room or a house on an informally occupied land. Okay, so it's a housing strategy. It's been a housing strategy since the 1950s or maybe even before that. This is housing by the poor. Okay, I always repeat what somebody has as something that I've learned from somebody, that squatting is not really a problem. It's a solution, right? It's a solution that the poor have found to enable themselves to have housing in cities where formal housing is very expensive. And then there's government initiated site upgrading. Okay, so this is not housing by the poor, strictly speaking, but then because the land is still informally occupied by them, it's still part of housing by the poor. It's just that they have initiated it, the people have occupied the land. And because the people have already occupied the land, government comes in to upgrade the site. So this is like the zonal improvement of President Marcos. So, but the people have actually initiated the process of development. And it's their presence which then invites government to do on-site upgrading. And then the incremental housing is always something that continuously happens. A third strategy is the people now initiate land tenure acquisition. So the community mortgage program is an example of this. The people there are many ways of negotiating land tenure. It can be through a presidential grant or a presidential proclamation, which has been done in some places, even in Metro Manila, like the National Government Center. So the president signs a proclamation and says, okay, this land can now be disposed to the people who are occupying it. Okay, so and then the community then will get, I mean, the families living there would get land tenure or formal land tenure. Sometimes the government would extend financing, as in the case of the community mortgage program, or it will waive certain fees, okay, so that the people can acquire the tenure without having to pay for the land. And then incremental housing is always, always a component. Um, Another would be community-led land tenure acquisition, people acquiring the land through purchase, also with the help of government, sometimes government financing, or sometimes direct purchase. Okay, sometimes they find independent sources of financing, which they can use to purchase land. So they acquire tenure, and then slowly they build housing, which is compliant with building codes, because normally the houses that are built by the poor are not compliant. They don't bother with building codes. Okay, so that's why government can easily evict them, because they're not compliant with building codes. And that's also sometimes why they are vulnerable to fires and other, well, other accidents or emergencies. No? So that can be urban poor initiated housing too. Okay, so that they try to comply with building codes when they can already afford to do that. And then finally, this land tenure acquisition as well, initiated by the community, but not just single housing, but multi-story or code compliant housing. So I'm just presenting to you this spectrum of strategies which the urban poor have in the Philippines, have actually used over time to house themselves. So these are people-led strategies. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this just visually represents this spectrum. Okay, on the very um, one end of the spectrum is the spontaneous occupation of land by the urban poor and building makeshift houses, and then they are incrementally improving it. So you will see many of them are already have two floors. No? And then on the right, this is the multi-story housing that I mentioned earlier. It doesn't look like it's community initiated, but this is in fact community initiated. No? This is in the Manggahan Floodway in Pasig, initiated by an organization, a community organization, with the help of government financing. So they were able to have this five-story housing built, through the people's initiative. So this is a spectrum from informality to formality. So I'll be talking about that a little more. No? So this is a transition. It's both a spectrum, and it's both a spectrum, but at the same time, it also describes a process. No? So by which certain urban poor move from informality to formality. I don't know, maybe at some point, maybe they also move from formality to informality. So we can look at it both as a spectrum in terms of different strategies that the poor have employed over the years, but you can also look at it as a process by which urban poor families have over time come to acquire formality, especially in terms of tenure. Next slide, please. Okay, so just pictures. So these are just, again, illustrating these different strategies. So this is informal land occupation, and so vacant land that people start to occupy. Maybe it's abandoned land. Maybe the owner is somewhere in the United States and not caring about the property and just waiting for the property to increase in land values. And then after 20 or 30 years, it will decide that the landowner might decide to just evict the people because now it is time for them to cash in on the property values, the high property values. But sometimes you find many of these private lands that are not being used, so people occupy it informally. without the consent of the owner. Maybe there is some enterprising katiwala, and so allows the people to settle and build their shanties on the land. So they occupy it informally with self-built housing, and they sometimes even also cater to renters. Next slide, please. So in my, I teach social, SOC Sci 12, which is the contemporary world. And one of the readings we use in that course is by Asef Bayat, Life as Politics. And he talks about the quiet encroachment by the ordinary. Okay, the quiet encroachment. No? So this is an example of that quiet encroachment. So the marginals, the urban marginals, those who live in the margins of society, unable to access what they need within the system, they use strategies in a quiet way. These are practices that are uncoordinated, individual decisions, but over time, because these practices are being replicated across society, they become a social force. No? So this is illustrated in the case of the Philippines, Metro Manila. No? So how can you ignore a problem of 4.5 million Filipinos, or 900,000, almost a million Filipinos unhoused legally, and so they occupy informal settlements. So this is an example of this quiet encroachment of the ordinary. So that's the occupation, no? The occupation of unused lands in the cities. Another strategy is the site upgrading and incremental housing. You will notice that there is a little more order, no, already in the community. Incremental housing is still being practiced by the people, but they have reblocked. So the urban poor are very familiar with this term, reblocking. So they rearrange their houses so that pathways are laid out in a more orderly fashion. So it facilitates mobility within the community, and it also makes for a better, maybe even safer places, no, for children to move around and to play. So that's part of the site upgrading, which can be initiated by the government or by the communities themselves. So these are just pictures. So next slide, please. To give you an idea of the spectrum, even visually, there are very different types of informal settlements. Okay, so let me talk about the community mortgage program as an example of people-led housing. People-led housing. So how does this program go? So what it would require is a registered community association. So the first thing that the community has to do is to organize itself into an association. So this is the first step of formalization. They become a registered organization, so they have to be SEC registered or some other, or registered with some government agency, so that they can have the certificate, no, of registration as a community association. So they go to a government housing institution. This is the Social Housing Finance Corporation. They take out a community mortgage. In other words, usually middle-class people and better off people get a mortgage. These are individual mortgages. No? So they borrow from a bank. Okay, they take out a loan as individuals. But here, the urban poor take out a loan as a community organization. That's why they have to be registered. So they get this loan from a government housing finance institution, the Social Housing Finance Corporation, and the goal is to acquire legal tenure through land purchase. Okay, sometimes the loan will also include a housing improvement component, or it might include also site development. But the most basic loan that one can take through the community mortgage program is for land acquisition, a land acquisition loan. So just to have legal tenure, because once you have legal tenure, then you can build your house. At least nobody will evict you anymore. So even if your house is still not code compliant, so maybe every now and then some government official will harass you and say that your house is not compliant and so on. But evictions are very rare simply because the house is not compliant. No, it's really more about land, the legality of the land occupation. Next slide, please. Okay. Just a little bit of history why we can consider it an alternative development, okay, by the poor. This was conceptualized in 1987, no, by former NGO workers, no, working in the Presidential Commission for the Urban Poor. Remember, this is the time of after the people power pricing, so there were many things that were happening that were innovative in a sense. They were initiated by former NGO people, some activists who have come to join the government because they had a vision that they wanted reforms in the government that could help meet the needs of the underprivileged and the basic sectors of society. So there was a responsive leadership at the time in the Housing and Urban Development Coordinating Council. So the concept was accepted and institutionalized at that time in a government corporation known as the National Home Mortgage Finance Corporation. Okay, so the concept really was this idea of a community loan. That was the new thing. Okay, so this was envisioned by an NGO worker because of an experience in Cebu City, that they fellow NGO workers were took out a loan as a group. Okay, so that was the basic idea, no, as a group, not as individuals. So this was applied to housing or providing housing finance for informal settler families. So it was operationalized as a program in 1989. So the initial funds came from the World Bank, and then government also put in its own funds through the pension funds of SSS, GSIS, and Pag-ibig. So the first batch, or in the first year, about 3,000 informal settler families were assisted. But after that, gradually it increased to about 10,000 on the average. And in 2004, a specialized agency, the Social Housing Finance Corporation, was created specifically to administer the community mortgage program. So this program was taken away from the National Home Mortgage Program after the Social Housing Finance Corporation was set up. Next slide, please. So that's just the history of how this came about. So this idea of community-led process came from NGOs that had already been doing a lot of community organizing since the time of Tondo. So from the 1970s, community organizing was already happening in the Philippines, in Metro Manila, certainly in many cities of the Philippines. And so this experience of communities trying to find solutions to their housing issues was already there. The experience was already there, but it was the first time that community organizations would then utilize resources coming from the government in the form of a loan. Okay, so that was the innovative part there. So it was a coming together of community organizations and the government. So it sort of exemplified people's participation in development, particularly housing for the poor. Okay, so but now I want you to appreciate how tedious this process is. Okay, it sounds very nice conceptually, this idea of partnership between organized people's organizations and the government coming together. But the process is so complex in a way, and government will have its own reasons why the process is such. No, but on the part of the people, it has become so burdensome. Really, first they have to form themselves into an association, so they have to go through some training, how to run an association. They will have to come up with a consensus that they really are committed to taking out a loan and to servicing this loan. And that takes a long time to convince everybody in a community to go along with a process like this, because it takes a lot of commitment. So first, the forming of an association. And so they have to register themselves. They register the association. So sometimes it would take maybe 6 months to get an HLURB registration. And then they have to look for a property to purchase, okay, if it's not on site. It's easier if it's on site. Sometimes easier because you don't have to look for the land, but you have to convince the landowner. And again, that can be also very challenging, how to get the landowner to agree not to sell you the property. If the landowner does not agree, then you have to look for another site, and that's very difficult to do. So negotiation with the landowner, negotiating on a price. So how do you know that this is a a good price, no, for the land. No? So you consult appraisers and so on. And then you build consensus on how to develop the property among the families living there. You have to come, the community will have to prepare what is called a site development plan. Okay, it's like a subdivision plan. Okay, so the individual lots are laid out. So some people may be occupying bigger lots. I mean, as is, but maybe they may be convinced to reduce their lot sizes to accommodate all of the households in the area. And again, that can be a very long process. No, convincing people, no, to move the boundaries, no, of the lots they are occupying. No? So and come up with a good subdivision plan that will be compliant with standards, because there are common areas that's a requirement of the law. So you do not only build all individual lots. You don't only make space for individual lots, but also for common areas. So again, that's a very challenging process to make the entire community. Oh, sometimes it's as small as 20 families, but sometimes it can be as big as 100 families or even more. So the consensus building process will take a lot of time and convincing and study among the members of the community themselves. And then they have to get approval of the subdivision plan from the local government. Again, a long process. And to get various permits from the local government. If you have had dealings with local governments, you know how difficult that can be. No? So sometimes there are so many requirements just to get the approval, and they've got many documentary requirements to fulfill. And then people have to start savings, no? So because they have to spend, no, for the community application, for the loan application process. And then the social housing or the government finance institution will also be requiring some initial savings from the community to demonstrate that the community is really able to service its loan. So they have to set up a bank account, they have to set up a collection system. And then finally, they're ready to apply. Maybe before the application, just putting together the requirements can take a community, as long as maybe 1.5 to 2.5 years, just putting together, all of these requirements and preparing the organization. So once they're able to apply already with social housing, they submit the requirements, then the loan documentation process proceeds. The land will be appraised, the title will be verified. So many other due diligence, no, which the financing institution will undertake, no, to make sure that the beneficiaries really are in need of public housing, which is this is really a subsidized loan, and so the government would want to make sure that these are really eligible families. And then finally, to be secure that the title, the landowner is legitimate, etc., and all of that. And then after the loan is taken out, of course, the payment will start. The people will have to do the collection, and will have to do will remit now the payments to the agency, to SHFC. This all sounds very simple and logical, but when the people are actually doing it, this is not as easy to do, very complicated. Oh, and in the meantime, there's a lot of capacity building, technical assistance that the NGO will be providing to the people, to the community. So a lot of support. So it's a lot of processes and education. The people will have to know about titles, about the process of getting this verified, getting a site development plan approved. So many things that they have to learn. So apart from the daily struggles that they have to go through, and the people to be able just to get housing, they have to go through this long process. And I asked an NGO how long this process normally takes. So they say it's about 2.5. You're lucky if you can get it approved 2.5 years now, including the social preparation, the organizing of the community association, 2.5 to 4 years. So it really takes a long process. Next slide, please. Okay, so in a sense, what are we doing here? I think that we are really privatizing a social problem, because homelessness is really a social problem. So it's not, when you have 4.5 million people, or about 1 million people, families, you know, that are homeless. This is a social problem. It's not really attributable to certain, you know, lack of capacities of people alone. So well, the basic question we're asking is the burdens that we are putting on the poor, you know, just to be able to get housing, formal housing or legal housing, isn't it disproportionate? No? So we don't expect it of other citizens, the non-poor citizens, so they can get housing much more easily, but the poor have to go through, you know, these very tedious processes just to get legal housing. So to what extent does participation, no, and under this label of participation, how much are we really unduly or disproportionately burdening them in achieving simple human development outcomes, simple human development goals, which we say is universal. So in a way, if it's universal, then it's really a right. No, if you take a rights-based approach, this is really a right which people should be having. And so the state or the government and society as a whole has an equal responsibility. But in this sense, in a program like this, even though we are giving an opportunity for the poor to gain legal tenure in terms of housing, there is so much that we are requiring from them. So the burden is too much. Is disproportionate, you know, for something that in a way they are really entitled to, if we take a human development perspective. Another issue is that these participatory modes unwittingly might be reinforcing a certain mindset, this blame the poor mindset, because some people have this notion that, or oh, the poor are poor because, you know, they're not organized, they lack initiative, or they do not save, you know, these biases against the poor, and it might unwittingly also reinforce that, because there is an expectation that they should work for their housing and to work as hard as this, no? But is that really fair? The third is the poor must change. It maybe the mentality that it is the poor who must change in order that their lives will become different. No? So there are certain changes that we expect from them. And it's as if no one else needs to change. In other words, it's just the poor have to work hard to get their housing. And the system is just fine. Okay, so it's just that we're giving them an opportunity, and that they should take advantage of this opportunity. It's their responsibility to them to pull themselves out of poverty and to overcome the inequities of society. So why is it that the burden of overcoming the inequities is on their shoulders and not on the rest of society? So I'm just showing that sometimes these concepts that we use, no, participation, resilience, these are very good ideas that have come up of development experience and development practice, and these seem to be creating opportunities for the poor, but we might be losing sight that there are certain implicit injustices in these concepts, no, of resilience building and participation. So is decent and safe housing for all a private good or a public good? No? So we can gain insights of this from the pandemic, that really now we are realizing that housing is not only a private good, it's a public good, because if not everybody has safe and decent housing, then public health can be endangered. Okay, so in other words, housing is now a public good. We have to make sure that people are in safe settlements, and health-wise, so that everybody else in the society is safe. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've talked about the quiet encroachment by the urban poor. I just made some quotes here, no, from Asef Bayat, just to highlight the point that we have come to a point where modernity has become a costly existence, and not everyone can really afford to be modern. And that is the reason why some of the urban poor might even resist formality, because formality requires obligations. No, it implies certain obligations from the person who acquires formality. And for example, in the case of community mortgage program, the costs will include the monthly amortization payments. Maybe previously they have not been paying for their housing. Suddenly now they have a big housing loan that they have to pay for 30 years, 25 years or 30 years. Imagine suddenly there are in debt, no, for 30 years, having to pay this monthly amortization. It can be as small as 500 pesos. It can be, 1,000 to 1,200 a month. Also, at some point, they will start paying property taxes, no, because now they own land. All right, so that's another cost of formality. Just to illustrate the point that there is a cost, no, to being legal and to being formal. Next slide, please. So in the state of housing, the fact that we have 4.5 million this is a systemic social problem. In other words, we can consider it as a public bad. No, it's not a public good, but a public bad. It's something that's bad for everybody, for the society. And in this pandemic, we can see that. No? The informal settlements, because of very dense population and very poor housing, it can bring about public health issues. If it's a public bad, then shouldn't the changes be coming from many other sectors in society and not just from the poor? So people-led development, so this language, this course about people-led development, resilience, participation could in fact be reinforcing these ideological messages, no, that reinforce these ideological messages that privatize a social problem and placing this burden disproportionately on the poor. And by doing so, we are actually reproducing the structural conditions of their exclusion from development. Why? Why? Because now it is preventing us from examining what else needs to change in our society aside from having giving more participation to the poor organizing themselves. And it's as if that's the only missing thing that's needed. Okay, so the poor helping themselves, but that's not true. We know that that is not true. So sometimes this discourse, people-led development, resilience, participation, could blind us, no, from these other things that need to change in our society. So we have to examine what really produced the deprivation and inequities in the first place. So I think we really have to look for an alternative to the alternative. We cannot remain content with simply the people-led development, resilience concepts and participatory concepts, because these are disproportionately burdening the poor. So I think this is my last slide. Tama ba? Yeah, it is. Thank you. I think I've gone over time. Sorry about that.
Thank you. No problem, Dr. Caraos. Thank you very much for a comprehensive and very insightful presentation. Incidentally, and I wish to apologize, Dr. Caraos, I wasn't able to introduce you officially kanina. May I be allowed to read your bio note? No? So for those who just came in, our first speaker is Dr. Ana Marie Caraos. She is fondly known as Jing, and she is a social development professional and an academic specializing in urban poverty research and policy advocacy. She is also the Associate Director and Head of the Urban Poverty and Governance Program of the John J. Carroll Institute on Church and Social Issues, which is an advocacy-oriented research center under the Philippine Jesuits. She is a part-time faculty member of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of the Ateneo de Manila University, and she earned a degree of Bachelor of Science in Management Engineering from Ateneo de Manila, an MPhil in Economics and Politics of Development from University of Cambridge, and a doctorate in Sociology from the New School for Social Research. So again, we are happy and honored to have you, Dr. Caraos.
Yes, thank you too.
Okay, so for our second resource speaker, we have with us, and we are also honored and pleased to have with us this afternoon, Dr. Melissa Quetulio Navarra. So Dr. Navarra is an assistant professor in Ateneo de Manila University, teaching sociology course, voluntary eviction resettlement, and housing prior to joining the Ateneo faculty. During years in the government, as head of the resettlement division, she designed, pioneered, and led government's participatory resettlement monitoring with community building in resettlement sites, and led the participatory remedial interventions in 18 resettlement sites with 30,000 families. Currently, Dr. Navarra continues to work with the resettled families through the Jolly Homes Foundation, an NGO that implements community organizing in informal settlements and resettlement sites. Dr. Navarra earned her master's in international studies from Kobe University, Japan, and her PhD in Wageningen University, the Netherlands. She has likewise published research on areas of social capital, food security, housing, and involuntary resettlement in the Philippines and Indonesia. So without further ado, Dr. Navarra, good afternoon and thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to Ateneo online community. Thank you, Professor Leviste, for inviting me here in this talk together with Ma'am Jing, my mentor, amid the build, no, and the pandemic. So let me share with you my slide. So Dr. Karaos explicated about finding an alternative to the alternatives and the need to examine how our alternatives benefit the target sector in the long run. Hold on to these realizations and questions while you listen to what I will share with you this afternoon, still about the context of resettlement of our informal settler families, their stories after the resettlement. So ISFs have been disadvantaged by the system, a traditional model of housing, and how after being silent, quiet, and passive, eventually decided to work together for a people-led development model and demand for the support of the government. Housing our poor, the poorest 30% of our population, has been dominantly privatized and supply driven. So the National Housing Authority, or NHA, regulates and provides incentives to the private sector for socialized shelter production. NHA is also responsible for the selection of resettlement sites and beneficiaries. So housing for our informal settler families is not free, as you can see in Table 1. Informal settler families apply for a housing loan either from NHA or the Social Housing and Finance Corporation and will amortize for the payment over 30 years. Over time, the loan ceiling for each informal settler family has increased steadily, yet the level of unaffordability of housing among our poor has remained. The gap between the required household income for the poor to access socialized housing loans has widened even more. So while poor families with combined income of 10,000 and higher can afford in-city people's plan housing and a loan ceiling of 400,000 and above, the rest or the majority are forced to access a 200 to 250,000 housing loan with units located in off sites 30 to 50 kilometers away where lands are cheap. So although the National Housing Authority, or NHA, would really intend to build better communities for the resettled families, their model for decades would always result to what you can see in the pictures. So they lack the basic services that a family needs to live a life with dignity. Offsite means disconnected from opportunities to earn social services and their old social networks who provide them instant support. Moreover, their new housing payable in 30 years is also vulnerable to disasters and they lack enough facilities like you can see in this picture, which accommodates 90 to 100 students in one shift. For decades, this has been the dominant development model for socialized housing. So poverty and selling of units are guaranteed. While this traditional model of resettlement has been questioned by the CSOs and the evaluation studies have been put forward, some of it were even written by Ma'am Jean Caraos and Professor Mary Racelis, it was only around 2014 onwards that the disadvantaged families and their community leaders living in different offsites located in the Luzon region bonded together to start changing their dismal living conditions, offer an alternative to models that do not work, and eventually winning and introducing significant reconfigurations in the conventional development model. So in the following slides, you will see how these two cases were won. So these cases were won by the resettled families themselves through this model. The model is a confluence of engagement, access, and counter-proposal. Engagement pertains to community organizing for power that these forerunners went through. In community organizing, it's our aim to shatter the culture of silence among the disadvantaged and realize together they have the power enough to penetrate the decision-making sphere. So this model is not a linear process. In fact, it is iterative, and sometimes the walls between the three elements are dissolved. As important as engagement is their access to the power holders, to bridges and linkages that are absent in their community, in their life world. Their social networks were saturated with bonds and redundant resources that could not bring them beyond their present condition. They needed to access new addition in their social networks. Those who are key to the resources they can obtain and use, like Nanlin has described on this slide. Professor Rosales asserted that these development paradigms that readily cancel out their intentions stem from a faulty paradigm, and that new ways of doing things should be adopted. This group of resettlement communities forged ahead to the battlefield with a counter-proposal for the decision makers to review and accept. Tirelessly, these groups worked on alternative proposals, optimizing their knowledge, their local knowledge, and collective examination of the given development model. So this first story showcases the landmark allocation of 1.8 billion remedy fund for 18 big resettlement sites. The case was 2.5 years in the making. So it took a long time, like taking out a community mortgage program project. The informal settler families, now number to 30,000 plus, started relocating in their resettlement communities in 2013 in view of the Oplan Likas program of the government. So from Metro Manila, they were involuntarily resettled in these locations. As expected, poverty took place abruptly. So in 2014, a year after the start of the relocation, the community organizers in the Resettlement Division and Presidential Commission for the Urban Poor, a government agency whose mandate is to look after the plight of the urban poor, started engaging with the resettled families. That time, there were already 5,000 families relocated. The community organizers 3 to 4 times a week would go to the sites and engage with the families who they would found at first quiet, distant, and not keen on participating in meetings. So the culture of silence has already taken place now. Gradually, through meetings and informal conversations, they started opening up to the organizers and realized that they're now in very bad situation compared to their lives in the Metro Manila slums. The promise of NHA that they would have a better life in the sites never came true. They said they wanted to complain, but they don't have money to spend for their transportation fare going to NHA and other offices. They also didn't know how to start documenting their complaints. So under engagement process, they were trained on different areas, engaging with the powerful and the decision makers, identifying and examining an issue, how to negotiate, etc. And to ensure that apart from the community leaders or leader-like partners, the rest of the community are also aware of the ongoing activities and the issues at hand. Public consultations were always convened. Consequently, the communities echoed a similar issue. They cannot live with dignity in their new communities due to apparent lack of major social services. And secondly, they cannot survive because of job loss as a result of displacement. Solidarity among the 18 sites was recognized as a vital strategy in the resolution of their issues. So with issues identified, it was already easy to proceed in community planning, which will serve as their counter proposal. So to produce this, they did identification of the issues and prioritization, formulation of the counter proposal, community vetting and approval, and agreeing on the strategies for the proposal to be accepted. Their counter proposal for the issues they identified, backed by hard evidence, demanded from the government a huge fund that will rectify their mistakes in the ground and provide them livelihood funds for small businesses. The solidarity likewise reached other partners in the civil society, the COM, the UPA, and ICSI. Together, they targeted to talk to the decision makers, NHA officials, and the lawmakers even. In the end, the chair of the Committee on Housing in the House of Representatives and Senate gave them opportunities to present their concerns in two congressional public hearings in September and October 2016, as you can see on the right picture. It was well attended by the civil society partners, relevant government agencies, the World Bank, lawmakers from House of Representatives and Senate. Their concerns were likewise presented to the cabinet cluster. Eventually, they gained new partners in these events. And in 2017, the Department of Budget and Management released for the very first time a remedy fund for these 18 sites amounting to 1.8 billion pesos. It's actually the first time remedy fund released to resettlement program. The funds were released to different agencies who have the mandate to carry out the needed services, as you can see in the picture on the left. No? Nonetheless, the procedures in spending the fund and implementing the identified programs were plagued with inefficiencies, and it was only after 2 years that you can now see the facilities built within the sites as monitored by the leader, posted in her Facebook account, the right picture. So the allocation of the 1.8 billion remedy fund is a landmark in the resettlement program. The entire process highlights that rectifying mistakes is costly to the government, not to mention to the social cost on the part of the disadvantaged families. The case also paved the way for this establishment of NHA resettlement standards that now include power, water schools, daycare centers, health centers, livelihood centers, basketball court, evacuation center, and other facilities. Furthermore, the case also underscored the long-time argument that for the urban poor, affordable in-city resettlement where physical and economic displacement is minimal is still the only viable option. ADB, JICA, and the World Bank all acknowledge this and now discourage off-site resettlement in their projects here in the country. Compared with the new sites, we're now on the second story. Compared with the new sites, old sites or those off-site resettlement built from 2000 to 2012 have been in much severe situation, considering that they've been surviving in these poorly built sites for almost 2 decades already. However, more than equipping their social services parched communities, they needed an urgent resolution to the eviction order they received from NHA in 2017 because of non-payment of amortization for decades. So just imagine being evicted for another round and from the resettlement site that the government built for them. Unlike the new sites, leaders from old sites are organized, with most of their sites already federated. Together with the Resettlement Division of PCUP again, they started reaching out to leaders from other off-sites through public consultations and house-to-house visitations. Eventually, most of the sites who, like them, are facing eviction joined the consolidation towards generating a solution. The partner CSO, COM, UPA, ICSI, and the Adamson University School of Governance also helped. There was a consensus on how to approach the eviction orders from NHA. A participatory research on the payment capacity of the residents was designed and implemented with the leaders doing most of the data collection from 1,046 respondents residing in 11 old resettlement sites. It was also planned to seek the help of the chair of Committee on Housing in the lower house who has the power to call in NHA for scrutiny. In December 2017, during the Urban Poor Solidarity Week celebration with the new and old sites resettlers, Congressman Benitez, chair of the Committee on Housing, announced that he would issue the House Resolution 1511, urging the National Housing Authority to grant amnesty on all penalties and surcharges in unpaid loan amortization and institute a loan restructuring program for beneficiaries in its socialized housing projects pursuant to RA 9507. A month later, in January 2017, during a hearing convened by the Committee on Housing, PCUP and the leaders reported the results of the participatory study on capacity to pay and payment rate in resettlement sites. It was emphasized that the impoverishment brought by the relocation to these sites left them nothing to pay for their increasing amortization, as substantiated by the study results. And in August 2018, months later, NHA released a new condonation program in response to the cries of the 100,000 plus families in old resettlement sites who were facing eviction. The memo circular condoned their accumulated penalties, arrears, and interest. Apart from this, the principal amount was restructured to accommodate the cap on the monthly amortization, which was set at 300 pesos. Lastly, the recommendation of the leaders to make their HOA or Homeowners Association for community-based amortization collectors of NHA, instead of outsourcing it to private sector, was likewise considered for pilot testing. So in these two cases, we have two takeaways. No? So the organized, capacitated, directly affected people themselves are the strongest catalyst for the perpetual introduction of the alternatives. It's not the practitioners, it's not the experts, nor the lawmakers and policymakers, because alternative models are founded on their local indigenous knowledge and examination of their situation. And secondly, our constant search for the better and fitting paradigm should always be the collective quest of the development workers and the partner sector, for nothing is static in our everyday lives. No? So way before the pandemic, families in Calauan, Laguna resettlement site were not interested in communal farming. So that was before the pandemic. No? So then came the pandemic, rubbing away their opportunity to earn and leaving their families in hunger. So this changed their mindset about farming. And last week, some of the leaders graduated from online trainers training offered by East West Foundation. So it's free online training for urban gardening. And now they will be training more leaders and will carry out communal farming with the guidance of East West Foundation in an 8,000 square meter land lent by NHA. So I will stop here, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Navarra, for a well-crafted presentation. Very insightful as well. So at this juncture, we would like to invite our audience to the conversation. I already noticed that some of you have already posted or written down some questions addressing our resource speakers. May I address these questions to Dr. Caraos first and foremost? There are questions coming from Mr. Texon. No? And the first question has something to do with recommendations that discourage people from going to the center. And is there a need to discourage them in the first place? And he also adds that I think one of the reasons why people are going to the center is because of economic opportunities that are perceived to be available in the cities. Your thoughts on this, Hamji?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, it's true that they come to the so-called center, mainly the highly urbanized centers of our country, because of opportunities there. But if you come to think of it, the flip side of that is they are providing valued labor to these centers. That's why there are job opportunities, because that means that the urban economies require labor from them. Okay, so they are in fact providing the labor that's being needed by the economic center, and that's why they're coming. It's the same logic with overseas migration. Okay, do we then blame our OFWs if they go to the countries that require their labor? I mean, they seek opportunities. It's the same logic. No, so the poor, when we talk about internal migration in our country, the reason that there are opportunities in the center, it's because there are labor requirements in the center that use the labor that's being provided by our, by migrants. So look at the industries that make use of their labor, the transportation sector, the construction sector. y- the construction industry will not thrive without the wage workers. Many of them are maybe not new migrants, but there have been migrants some time ago. Okay, so the security agencies, hotel and restaurant industry, all of this make use of the labor of the informal settlers and the urban poor. No? So when we think of a phenomenon like this rural to urban migration, we look at it that way. But another way of looking at it is because they attract the workers because the work is being produced here because value is being produced in the center, and the value to be realized requires labor. It requires the workers, so they come here. So the process of reverting it, I know that we have thought of so many of these balik probinsya kind of incentives, but they don't really work. For one, how can you reverse that process? So bringing the people back to the countryside, but in the countryside as well, they are going to the cities. These are cities that they are going back to, and the cities in the regions. These are also regional centers which are attracting migrants also from the countryside in their respective regions. So if you're bringing back balik probinsya, migrants from Manila, for example, back to the cities, you will be taking away job opportunities from people who are already in those regions seeking work in the regional centers. Now, so it won't really work. So these incentives. So the natural response of people is to seek work where they are available, and so work that's being provided, in the urban centers creates value, and it actually benefits uh, the the owners of industries in the cities, because they make use of the value of the work that's being provided by the migrants. And besides, many of our urban workers now are not really new migrants, so many of them have come here many years before.
Thank you, Dr. Caraos. As a follow-up to that, I think there was a question as well from the same participant, Mr. Texon, if creating economic hubs in these provinces, would be a long-term solution, or would be an alternative, shall we say, approach in such a way that it actually would make people uh, focus on these instead of going to the center, so to speak.
Yeah, I will invite you to look at the latest data from I believe it's the PSA. I'm not sure now. I have to check that what it shows. The latest data have shown that migration to big cities like the Metro Manila, for example, has actually decelerated already. So there is a natural corrective mechanism, really, because people really go to those places where the work is available. No? So there are some urban centers in more Metro Manila, I forget now which ones, which are attracting the migrants. So remember, when we talk of economic hubs outside of Metro Manila, we're not talking of rural areas, no, or the countryside. We're talking also of urban centers in other regions outside of Metro Manila. So these are also urban centers now that are becoming the economic new centers, no, in their respective regions. And that is a natural process. They necessarily, because value is being created there, and so work is also being needed in those economic centers, and so people from the countryside go there. In other words, they will also be attracting migrants from the countryside in those regions. So it's not enough that the people from Metro Manila will go to, for example, the regional cities in Samar or in Leyte. That they will go to Tacloban, etc. Maybe some of them do, but the greater number would be really be coming from the other rural areas in those regions as well.
Thank you, Dr. Caraos. In the meantime, we will actually address questions that are directed to Dr. Navarra. No? And there's a question regarding the law which enables 20% balanced housing. And the participant is wondering whether this is really a solution as far as ISFs are concerned.
Thank you. Yeah, for the question. Well, the Balance Housing Act, no, the 20% of the fund used by contractors, by developers, would the intention is really for the income to go to these ISFs in our country. Well, some of it I'm not really so sure, no, because it's really the Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board that decides on how to spend the 20%, and the civil society organizations are actually they really want to see how they decide, no, on how much would go to this municipality and how much would go to other municipalities. But then we know that it's being spent for ISFs, for slum upgrading, and for building other housing units. But then we don't know the mechanism. So there's this development, and there's this Department on Housing and Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development. And during the consultation, they were requested to take a look at the implementation of the 20% Balance Housing Act, and see how it would really trickle down to the informal settler families of our country, and also to the families already resettled in the offsites.
Thank you, Dr. Navarra. There is a question that's addressed to both of you. It's from Dr. Lopez Wee. And the question has something to do with successful models overseas, which probably we can look at and adopt. Are there such models, particularly which you, the two of you, are somehow, shall we say, recommending or perhaps looking into or further studying that might be applicable to the Philippine situation? Your thoughts on this? We can go with Dr. Caraos first, and then Dr. Navarra.
Yeah, well, I remember learning about this the movement in Brazilian cities. No, so that I think it's a little improvement over our present people's planning process, community mortgage process, and the community mortgage program, and the high density housing program, in the sense that the government, from what I understand, the government is somehow taking care of certain transaction costs, or subsidizing the community organizing process, for example, so that the process of housing the informal, previously informal settlers do not become so unduly difficult, no, for the poor, and it becomes an easier process, because this is being taken care of by community organizers that are being hired by the government. But before they were able to get to that point, there was maybe a lot of social movement process that took place in these Brazilian cities. And also, as we know, some of the governments, in these Brazilian cities are also led by reform minded and somewhat socialist oriented, socialist oriented government. So that's one improvement, no? So it's really a matter of making it easier for the poor, like some of these transaction costs, like getting the government permits, which, well, one would imagine this is something that the government itself, different agencies of government could do better in coordinating among themselves, so that people do not have to go from one agency to another, following up their papers or getting approvals and then moving to another agency. Some of these are intergovernment processes which could be handled by the government instead of having the people this um, do this work. I know that in the previous administration, the Social Housing Finance Corporation sort of tried to do studies along this line. So, how can it simplify the processes? It's the requirements. So, in the sense that maybe SHFC as a government agency will be the one now relating with other government agencies, even with local governments, to follow up certain processes, something like that. So that the principle being that the government takes on a little more of the responsibility, so that the poor are not unduly overburdened by the inefficiencies of government itself. So they're the ones always making up, for the dysfunctions, of the system. And so in principle, that's something that maybe we have to look into. How do we address those issues? Yeah. Public housing in other countries, rental housing, that might be another example that I've heard. But sometimes they say that the track record of public housing programs, I'm talking of rental housing programs in other parts of the world, is not really that good. But we have a local example, in Valenzuela, that's public rental housing. Maybe over time we can study that experience to see its relative successes vis-a-vis other modes, because that would be simpler. People occupy. We do away with so many of these transaction costs, for example, that the community mortgage program entails. However, the difference is that because it's rental, people will not get to own the units. But then some of the urban poor are not really interested in ownership. In fact, they prefer that. Many of them are actually renters now, and that's perfectly fine with them. They're renting rooms and accommodations in informal settlements. They're fine with renting. So you get a section of these rental people who are renting, and provide them public rental housing, very little transaction cost. It's highly subsidized, but there's a reason for government to be subsidizing housing. Because my point really, it's a social problem. It's a public good to be able to provide good housing to our citizens, because it will make everybody safe. If a big segment of our population live in unsafe environments, then the rest of us are also not safe. So there's a public good to be achieved by providing decent housing for a great number of our homeless citizens. So these are things that we can look at. Looking at the different levels of security. It need not be ownership. So there's housing, that rental housing, that we can look at, that can be publicly provided. But the big question is the location. Actually, that's always the problem. Finding it, making available locations that are in city, because these are the locations that would work for the poor, who are the workers of the city. And so the intervention that really government needs to do is to make available lands that are otherwise being used for private commercial purposes. So that entails political will, but at the same time, it makes a lot of economic sense and social justice sense to make land, in city land, available for a big number of the city's workers. So that's what it is. So I think that the solutions can be found, along those lines.
Thank you, Dr. Corrales. Dr. Navarra, your thoughts?
Yeah, so similar from Ma'am Jean, from Dr. Jean, no? It's still improving the people's plan approach, but there's this model in Thailand, it's CODI, no? Wherein you have the government taking in a huge chunk of the work for this informal settler family. So it's different from the Philippines, because in the Philippines, the organized communities have to go through several steps, and they really need to spend their own money for these transactions. But in CODI, it's streamlined, because they just need to sometimes the government would even offer them the land. So the government already has available lands for them. They just need to select, no? And then they just need to apply and go through the application process, and everything is provided for them. So it's easy. No, it's not very hard, but still, it's still people's plan. It's still very consultative, no? So at the community level, it's the homeowners association or the people's organizations who takes charge of the organizing. But then when it comes to applying for the housing, it's already the work of the government. So we're looking at that direction that, you know, later on we can really streamline the processes for this people's organizations, and we would even fund for the community organizing efforts at the grassroots level. Another thing is, of course, public rental, no? Because not all can afford housing, and some can even afford maybe just 50 pesos a month or 100 pesos a month, no? But then they still need to live a life with dignity. And as Ma'am Jing mentioned, this is a social problem, and housing is a public good, no? So we want them to be living in a safe space where their children can study, and then so public rental is suitable for them. But then, of course, the public rental has to be maintained, because we can see the Paradise Heights in Tondo. It's in city. It's built by NHF. But then look at it now. Like 40% of the in city resettlers already left because they're scavengers. They said they cannot afford it, and also the maintenance has been so bad. So it's now in a slum-like condition. And lastly, um, we need to make housing the poor an integral part of the land use planning. No, they cannot just be afterthought. They should be in the city. No, like the rest of the middle class, the rest of the other classes, no, there should be a space for them within the city, and not throw them out 30 to 50 kilometers away, because they are our citizens, and they serve the local. No?
Thank you, Dr. Navarra. We have room for two more questions. Unfortunately, while we would like to extend this conversation further, but in the interest of time, we are focusing on two questions. The second to the last question, I will be addressing to Dr. Caraos, and the final question from me will be addressed to Dr. Navarra. Proximity to the centers of power and its impact on lobbying or on pressurizing authorities to, shall we say, attend critically and shall we say, urgently to the needs of informal settlers. And Dr. Rosales is asking what the prospects of success are, you think, for informal settlers that are living far away from these centers of power. And as a follow-up question to that, do LGUs actually, or local governments actually help them or provide spaces for them to gain those rights and privileges? Your thoughts on this, G?
Yeah. I my internet froze for a while. I just caught the last part, which is the question from Dr. Racelis. Can I? Is that all? I mean, or did I miss another question?
Okay, let me read it to you, Ma'am Jean. The entire thing. Much of the success of strong community organizing in Metro Manila and environs is being close to the center of power, where POs and NGOs can pressure and negotiate with the national government. Can you give us your views on prospects for informal settlers gaining their rights in small and larger sized cities far from the national government? Do LGU cities offer good or not prospects for people's organized demands?
I think the legal framework in our country, which is mainly the Urban Development and Housing Act, precisely mandates local governments to be the primary actors, no, in addressing the urban housing problem. So in terms of the legal basis for action and responding to the housing issue, that's very much with local governments, because in the first place, they're being authorized and even mandated to find land in their respective jurisdictions that can be used for social housing. I think the support that local governments would be needing would be maybe in terms of financing, because well, once local governments are able to identify lands that are suitable for social housing in their respective jurisdictions, these lands, some of these might be privately owned, and so that would require some resources on the part of the local government, which might not be there. So in other words, that's where the national government support could come in. But there are institutions that can do that. So I think if the local governments take the initiative and take the leadership, they can very well respond to these issues. I think it is true that the examples, for example, about the resettlement projects that Dr. Navarra presented to us, it's because they're in Metro Manila, and the Congress is also here in Quezon City, and the people can make their voices directly heard, by these legislators, by the housing committee, and respond to these demands very quickly in terms of a resolution and something which can be directly acted upon by the Department of Budget and Management, because they are all here in Manila. That is true for large scale projects like this. But I think there's also room for that kind of people's organizing, making or putting pressure on local governments, and local governments can also respond because they have the legal basis for responding. Um, and that has been shown in some cities. That's true. No? In some cities in Metro Manila, but I guess in other parts of Metro Manila also, with a community mortgage program, which has had quite a number of takeouts, in provincial cities, outside of Metro Manila. But still, these are people initiated. No? They are the people themselves that organize um, their communities to be able to access financing from the government. No, sometimes with some input from the local government, but sometimes really just on their own. But I think yes, in places outside Metro Manila, local governments can also very well respond to these organized pressure from communities if it is a matter of providing housing, but as long as this is backed up by what Dr. Navarra is mentioning, a land use plan, the CLUPs which are being done by local governments that really make available socialized housing sites and very clearly delineate them. Uh, but this is something that organized citizens, can really pressure local governments to do. In this, especially in those cities which are not yet highly urbanized, before they turn into becoming mini Metro Manilas, where land has become very expensive and not anymore affordable not even affordable even to the middle class. So how much more to the urban poor?
Thank you, Ma'am Jean. Finally, for Dr. Navarra, this question comes from Dr. Mario Aguja of MSU Gensan. And the question has something to do with the disconnect, the apparent disconnect between the formulation of a development agenda that is urban-centric, so to speak, and the reality of rural development. Are there ways, he wonders, are there ways by which we can craft a development agenda that incorporates urban issues and rural development issues? And he also asks if there is really, or is it valid to say that there is really a glaring disconnect between the two as far as current development agenda is concerned? Your thoughts, Dr. Navarra?
Thank you, Dr. Aguja. Well, I've seen over time, no, I've seen the development agenda of each administration, and you can see that NEDA recognizes the nexus between rural and urban development. That's why constantly you have rural development and you have urban development in the development agenda, and housing is always there. Housing is always put on a spotlight. No, what happened is that when you implement this development agenda, you now have different factors at play. You have politics, you have priorities. No, so it's difficult now if our development agenda is heavily influenced by these factors. So maybe for us who would really want to see change, no, is to really be united in pushing for the real implementation of the genuine implementation of development agenda, and the constant monitoring of the implementation of this development agenda, because we already have the mechanisms. We have the RDC, we have Regional Development Council, who are supposed to meet like every month, no, looking at how this development agenda is cascaded in different provinces, in different regions. But then still, there are more powerful forces at play. So it's still these factors that are beyond us. Now, if we are not united, they can take over this beautiful development agenda. The development agenda of each administration is always well crafted. They're crafted by the experts, no? They're crafted by different studies. They would cite, relevant studies, and yet when they get implemented, they're just, disregarded totally, because it's not a priority. It's not a priority of this locality. It's not a priority of this district. It's not a priority of this province. So still, we need to constantly monitor the implementation and constantly question, no, and challenge the implementers of this development agenda.
Thank you very much, Dr. Navarra. On this note, we would like to thank our resource speakers, Dr. Jing Caraos and Dr. Belis Navarra, for generously sharing their time with us this afternoon. And again, on behalf of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of Ateneo de Manila, as well as the DSA's Public Sociology and Anthropology Initiative, the Anthropological and Sociological initiatives of Ateneo or Asia, we would like to thank our resource speakers and our, shall we say, online learning communities, our webinar participants, for joining us this afternoon. This has been a stimulating and an insightful engagement, and we hope to see you again in our future webinars. So please stay tuned. So again, thank you very much and take care. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am Jing. Thank you, Melis.
Thanks, Nino.
Thank you too.
Thank you, Kaloy. Thank you, Ado.
No problem, sir.
Thank you, sir.